make our way down here to the banks of the River Spree, the main river that runs through the center of the city, I want to point out these two large statues that you see here. These two statues are of Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, the fathers of communism. As we said, we're in the former East Berlin. In fact, this was the area right here that was the former government headquarters belonging to communist East Berlin, which means today, over 20 years after the reunification and the fall of the Berlin Wall, you'll still see many traces of that communist past still here in this part of town. Another vivid demonstration that this city was divided for those 40 years, this part of town being under communist rule. And not only will you see the statues here in this park, but also you'll find many different Soviet war memorials that are all around town. War memorials that have the hammer and the sickle on it. The war memorials were supposed to remember those fallen Red Army soldiers during the last major battle of the Second World War, the Battle of Berlin. But really it contributes to a very interesting identity here in Berlin today. So really keep your eyes open, because it's examples like these that remind you that the city was divided between a democratic West and a communist East for those 40 years during the 20th century. Now, Berlin, of course, today is the capital of the Federal Republic of Germany. It's a city of around 3.5 million people, making it Germany's largest city. But it's not a very old city in European standards. It's actually a city that dates back to the early 13th century. In fact, if we go back to about 800 years ago, when we see the first written records of civilization appear in this area in the year 1237, not a lot was going on here. For the most part, Berlin was a pretty boring place, founded initially as a trading post right here on the banks of the River Spree. Now, the Spree River is the main river that runs through the center of the city, the same river that you'll see several times during your stay here. Now, at this time, Berlin was a very marshy and a very swampy area. In fact, it's been said that the name Berlin is an old Slavic word that means swamp. So I guess you could say that you're going to be exploring a swamp town, and this also reveals two things. The first of which being the first people here to this area who settled this area were of Slavic tribes, and secondly, Berlin has a very high water table underneath the ground, which means that when construction companies excavate the land, get it ready for development, they have to extract an enormous amount of water out of the ground. You can see that's the case that's going on right across the street here, or across the river here rather, with all the construction that's going on. You see those blue pipes way over there in the distance. You also find very hideous pink pipes around town above ground. These are water pipes, and these water pipes are supporting then a construction site where water's being extracted from that construction site, goes into these pipes. The pipes take the water down here to the River Spree. So if you see these pipes around, chances are there's a construction site nearby. As you can clearly see, we've got one just across the way from us. Now, just like any other major European city, every other major European capital, Berlin did have a monarchy that lived in this city up until 1918, and they were called the House of Hohenzollern. And they would arrive here in the city in the 15th century. And eventually they would really turn this area into a an area that was not a very important part of the country into a very prominent European state. As in 1701, this royal family would control the Kingdom of Prussia. And Prussia is what would make up current-day parts of Poland, current-day parts of Russia. And they would build a palace that would be situated just across from us here, across the water. Now, on this whole open area, you don't see a palace any longer. That's because it was destroyed during the Second World War. Although there's one piece of this palace that is still being preserved, and it's in that glass building that you see way over there in the distance. You see that glass building, which is an international business school. You see those two gold balconies. That one piece that looks really out of place, that's the only piece of that palace that's still being preserved. And that's where all these kings that controlled Prussia would have lived and ruled. And this is what the palace once looked like. This would have been taken from the other side of the cathedral, looking over here in this direction. So the Hohenzollern family, very important in turning Prussia here in the north, Berlin, its capital, into a very powerful European state. And then in 1871, with the unification of Germany, that's when they would then become German emperors, as Berlin would become the seat of the German Empire, an empire that would last up until 1918. With that German defeat in the First World War, that's what brought the empire to an end. The last German emperor, a man by the name of William II, he would abdicate from his throne. Germany would now take on its very first attempt at a democracy under the so-called Weimar Republic, but that was a democracy that would sadly last for just 14 brief years until Hitler came to power in 1933 and installed his dictatorship. Now, folks, since 1918, Berlin has not seen a monarchy. In fact, today there's not even a symbolic representation of the House of Hohenzollern, like what you find in other parts of Europe today, where other countries continue to honor and respect and recognize the traditions and the history of their monarchies. The family is still around. They live over in the western part of the country today. Interestingly, they have never officially relinquished their throne, but this is something that is not recognized by the Federal Republic of Germany today. So I guess you could say that all these descendants of all these Prussian kings that became the emperors of Germany are now just self-proclaimed princes and princesses of the old Prussian state. After the First World War, that's when the state government seized almost all fortunes and all assets belonging to this royal family. And they turned their palaces into places of culture, a place where a traveling exhibition would make their way to, a place where a picture gallery would open up in. Today they've gone so far, especially those that have been rebuilt since the Second World War, have now been turned into restaurants, fancy hotels. So really taking on very different purposes for which they were initially built, which is really, really sad if you think about it, how this family played such a pivotal role when it came to the history of Europe and development of Germany in the 19th century. So now we've got a couple of their buildings that we're going to see along the way as we make our way up in this direction. I think the most prominent building that still stands today is their place of worship right over here, the Berlin Cathedral. Now the Berlin Cathedral is not as old as its neo-Baroque facade would lead you to believe. This is actually a structure that dates back to the year 1905, and this became the official Protestant church belonging to the House of Hohenzollern. Now granted, there has always been a church here on this location, just that back in 1905, the Prussian king, a man by the name of William II, living across the water here, was also enjoying the status of being Germany's emperor. He was a very spiritual man. He really wanted to have a place of worship that sent the right messages, and so he commissioned some architects to design just that. And if you take a look here, the main intention behind the architecture was to rival St. Peter's in Rome. So if you've been to St. Peter's, perhaps you can see some similarities. I don't know if you compare the two structures. I think it's safe to say that St. Peter's clearly won. But at any rate, it was gutted internally by fire during the Second World War. This is a very good example of one of those buildings here in the city center that was gutted internally, but rebuilt within its exterior walls. That's why on the facade here, if you take a look very closely and pay attention to the facade, you'll see all these little patches, little dark patches. Those dark patches were bullet holes were filled in. Bullet holes from the Second World War. So really, I tell folks to always keep their eyes open when they come to Berlin, because yet today, in January of 2013, you will still see traces of the Second World War. Be it right here on buildings. You'll find bullet holes that haven't been filled in yet. Chunks still missing from buildings. You know, unlike other wars such as World War I, where a lot of the battles are fought in the countryside, World War II was fought in some of Germany's most beloved, most historic, and most treasured cities, which ruined hundreds and hundreds of years of history. Right here in Berlin, between 1940 and 1945, during the Second World War, the United States Air Force and the Royal Air Force would combine to drop around 68,000 tons of bombs on this city. That would destroy over 600,000 homes and wipe out nearly 70% of the city center in over 350 air raids. So, as I said again, those buildings that were gutted internally by fire, many of them have been rebuilt within their exterior walls, and this is probably the best example. The cathedral itself was reconstructed, the interior that is, during the 1970s by the East German government. It wasn't a very serious effort that was put forward. I think, in my opinion, they could have probably been a little bit more serious in bringing it back to its pre-war status. It wasn't until the 1990s that the reunified government took over then. Off here, immediately behind the old museum, the one with the red flags flying from the top off to your right, that is the newly rebuilt new museum. And today, the new museum is the home of the Egyptian collection. This is where you'll find that 3,300-year-old iconic bust of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti on display. And then right behind it, you can see just barely straight down from us here, that dark facaded building. That's the beloved Pergamon Museum. Pergamon Museum, our most popular museum in town. Some 1.2 million people visited the Pergamon last year. This is where the archaeological collection is. This is where you'll find many different artifacts from the Middle East, the Babylonian Ishtar Gate from Miletus, the Pergamon altar, just to name a few. So again, lots of variety around here. And if you come to Berlin and you're really into history and you want to get more on a lot of what we're talking about today, you can't miss this museum right here. This is the German History Museum. The German History Museum is by far my favorite museum here in Berlin. They've got a lot of history in there from prehistory all the way up till today. Sorry, information in there from prehistory all the way up till today. A lot of artifacts on display that really support and complement that information. And folks, if you're looking for that World War I, World War II, Third Reich, Cold War, Berlin Wall History Museum, so in other words, German history during the 20th century, this is certainly the museum that you'll want to check out before leaving town. It's open till 6 p.m. this evening. The admission is around €8, but if you have a student card on you, you'll get that for half the price. So just quite a nice bargain. Now this building historically is the oldest building here on Unter den Linden. This street right here now that starts going way down to the west, running east-west through the heart of the city. This is the old Royal Boulevard that the royal family used to use as they would leave their palace, make their way down the street all the way to the Brandenburg Gate to enter and leave the city from. Now this is the old Zeughaus, or the Armory, dating back to 1706, the oldest building. This is where the royal family stored their weapons. I always tell folks to take out their cameras and take a picture of this because I can guarantee you that this is probably the only pink armory building on the continent of Europe today. But we said today that it has been converted into a history museum, just like the building that you see across the street here. Much of these buildings have been almost completely rebuilt since the Second World War. The one to the white building to our left here, this has been completely rebuilt. This was the old commandment center for the guards. And then the one next door, that sort of beige-looking building, was the Crown Prince's Palace. That's where the heir to the throne had his official residence. This is probably one of the most important and interesting buildings here in this part of town. This is the old guardhouse, and the guardhouse dates back to the year 1816, and after it was completed just a couple of years later, this is where all the watchmen were stationed as they would keep watch over this part of town, particularly keeping their eyes on the Crown Prince's Palace just across the street, as we pointed out before. Now, it did survive the Second World War for the most part. Miraculously, large portions of the structure still remained intact. And after the reunification in the 1990s, the reunified government converted this into an official war memorial that would be dedicated to those people who have lost their lives through war and tyranny. So basically, it's a general war memorial. But what stands inside here is probably one of our most beloved memorials that we've got here in the city today. And I'm going to show you, you're going to make your way right up here to the entrance in just a second to see this and take some pictures of it. Inside here, there is a replica sculpture, which is the work of a Berlin artist named Käthe Kollwitz. Now, real sadly, Käthe Kollwitz was a pacifist who lost her youngest son during the First World War. And she spent years exercising her grief through art thereafter. And what she ended up completing in early 1938 is a sculpture that depicts a mother holding her dying son in her arms. And today that replica sculpture stands inside this building here as a visual symbol and as a constant reminder of the heartache and the tragedy that must have been felt by so many German mothers during that First World War. And what really makes this memorial unique is the fact that inside here, a hole has been cut in the ceiling. And that hole exposes that sculpture to all weather conditions 365 days of the year. So when it's raining out, you can make your way inside the building. You won't get rained on, but as soon as you get inside the building, you'll see the rain coming down in the sculpture. Same sort of situation in the wintertime. When it snows, you'll see a pile of snow. Well, yesterday you would have seen a pile of snow. It has warmed up overnight quite significantly. You can see everything is starting to melt here. But normally you'll see a pile of snow here on the sculpture during the winter months. And the symbolism behind this is, just like a soldier who went out to fight in that First World War, he too was exposed to all weather conditions 365 days of the year. Now, it is a war memorial. That's why I explain all of this outside here. Nonetheless, I do invite you to go up here now. I see that the rope has just been taken off, so you will be able to make your way inside. Right before the sculpture, right on the ground, you'll see an inscription. And that inscription, translated into English, says, "To the victims of war and tyranny." So go on inside, have a look, and then just meet me right over here by these flagpoles.